If price optimization and monetization have been on your mind recently, you will find this episode super useful. Patrick Campbell is the founder and CEO of ProfitWell, a software that helps subscription companies with their monetization and retention strategies. In this episode, we discussed when is the right time to start thinking about monetization, the golden rules of an outstanding pricing page, how to decide what to bundle with your main pricing and what to leave as an add-on, why design and brand have huge impact on our willingness to pay, and much more. Enjoy this episode, and if you want to share your feedback, drop me an email at desi@pony.studio.
Welcome to The Product Show. Insightful interviews with founders and tech leaders sharing how they hack product growth.
Hey Patrick, welcome to The Product Show.
Yeah, happy to be here. Excited that we can finally connect.
It's a pleasure to finally have this chat with you. I'm a huge fan of what you guys are doing at ProfitWell. I love how you're using data and research, the tools you're building, your experience, your expertise to demystify monetization in the subscription economy. I think this is something the industry really needs. So tell me a little bit more about yourself. What's your background and how did you decide that the world needs ProfitWell?
Yeah. So before I never wanted to get into business or tech. That was never a dream of mine growing up. I started my career, I worked in US intelligence for the US government. And then I worked at Google. In that kind of transition happened because I was, wanting to save the world and wanting to make the world a better place. So I was like, oh, let's go work for the government and let's, do a bunch of fun stuff. But basically, whenever you work for the government, you realize just how bureaucratic it is. And when you're a young, ambitious kid, working for a big bureaucracy is not that interesting. And so I thought, oh, let me go to a giant tech company. That'll be less bureaucratic, sarcasm intended there. And that was very bureaucratic as well. And so I just started basically, not through foresight, but just kind of through reacting to the environment, learned that I wanted to work for myself, or I wanted to work on a small team. And so ended up jumping into the startup world and started ProfitWell a number of years ago. And we started off purely in pricing. We started with a pricing piece of software, and now the mission's kind of expanded. But the basic idea is that we help companies basically with their revenue and accelerating their revenue. And the idea really came from, I was working at a company doing their pricing, and I realized, something that was super important, but no one really knew anything about. And that was kind of like this is a good idea, and it's a good idea that we can kind of push forward. So, yeah, that's the rambly version of how I got here.
Just to explain a little bit more for people who are not familiar with ProfitWell, what exactly you guys are doing? Is it a product? Is it a service? And the other interesting question, I guess, is how do you collect the data and how do you use it?
Yeah, so we have multiple products. So our core product is something called ProfitWell Metrics. It's used by about 25,000 different subscription companies. And basically you plug in your billing system, Zora, Stripe, Braintree, whatever you're using for your billing. And we give you access to all of your subscription financial metrics. So your MRR, your cohorts, we give you segmentation. We enrich your customer data with Clearbit and Full Contact for free. And then we also give you access to benchmarks. And that's all given away for free because it allows us not only to study the data and implement that, that understanding into our products, but it also helps us obviously get leads and kind of create the requirement where we're able to kind of show you like, hey, you have this problem and this problem, you should really use this product, which happens to be one of our paid products. And so then our other products are the two that are probably most relevant to talk about. One is something called Retain. So it automatically reduces your churn, your cancellations. So you just plug it in and it goes to work. And then the other product that's kind of relevant is Price Intelligently, which I think is you're referencing. And that's a a software product where we collect data in the market. And the way that we collect that data is basically by going to current customers or, basically prospects, and basically answering some questions or asking them some questions. And then we filter that data through our algorithms to get at, what willingness to pay looks like and things like that. So yeah, it's a little bit all over the place, but the idea is that if you're a subscription company, our goal is to make you money through our products and do that in a way that you don't have to like lift a finger. Essentially, it just works.
Okay, so as part of my job, I work with dozens of founders, market managers, product managers a month. And you won't believe it how often monetization, profitability, and sometimes even the business model, you just haven't thought about it. We sometimes even have to build products for clients that still don't know how they're going to make money. And I find this absolutely insane. People are, and sometimes founders even, they're brushing it under the carpet, they're leaving it for later. Later is sometimes too late. Why is that? Do you think it's been fueled by overfunding in the startup ecosystem in the last few years, or is there more to that?
I think we're lazy. I think that's, and we're not lazy in the sense of like, we obviously work hard, right? But we like to go towards the path of least resistance. And when you think about building your business, the path of least resistance in your mind is to get the dopamine of getting new customers, right? So let me run a new ad campaign. Let me run a new content campaign. Let me do, XYZ. That's the path of least resistance. That's what we want to go after. The issue is that oftentimes thinking through like, what is the best way to retain our customers? What's the best way to monetize customers? That not only has resistance in the fact that it's harder, and I don't think it's difficult, but it does take more effort, I should say. But also, it's something that you don't really learn about, right? Like, there's so much data out there and so much content out there about how to get your customers, how to do this, how to run this ad campaign, and those types of things. But in reality, it's one of those things where you're sitting there and you're all of a sudden just like, oh, let me go run that new ad campaign because I don't know what I'm doing here. And I think it's going to be too hard. So I think it's just a mindset. And I think what's interesting is that in the past couple of years, the market's gotten harder and harder, where you got to be good at acquiring customers just to survive, let alone to thrive. And the result of that is you're just kind of seeing in the market that we're living in a world where you're kind of be forced to care about these things and forced to look at these things. So yeah, long story short, I think it's just a path of least resistance problem that we think to, we don't think, we all of a sudden think very differently when it comes to solving these problems, when in reality you just need to think the same way you think about everything else in your business.
When do you think is the right time for a SaaS company to start thinking about monetization and subsequently for profitability?
It's not necessarily about profitability, but that does have a piece of that. I think profitability, it depends on your type of business, right? So if you're heavily venture backed and you're kind of on that treadmill, obviously you can, change up when you think about profitability when it makes sense. If you're a bootstrap business or a customer funded business, you have to think about bootstrapping early on. You have to think about profitability early on. I think that the thing with monetization is you want to be thinking about it from the get. You want to be thinking about it from the early stages of your business, because if you think about what you're doing with monetization, you've created some sort of value as a company. And because we don't trade in economies, at least most of us that are, hey, we're bartering for goat or wheat or something like that. You have to ascribe a currency value to that particular product that you've created. And so it's the very essence of what you're doing. And so it's less about like when, and it's more about what is the order through which you should do things. Because should you worry about your exact specific price point in the early days? Probably not. You just kind of need to know, am I €100 product? Am I €1,000 product? These types of things. But should you worry about your value metric, like how you charge? Absolutely. That's like the number one thing to figure out in the early days. Am I per user, per 100 visits, per 1,000 whatsits or widgets? that's the important question. So it's a constant thing. It's just you don't have to worry about all of it all the time. And that's the misconception that comes with pricing. Like this is the only area, and probably only area. I'm sure there might be something else, but it's one of the only areas in your business where you apply an all or nothing mindset to, which is kind of crazy. Like you don't say, oh my gosh, our product needs to be perfect before we ship it. Oh, our marketing campaign needs to be perfect and we can't ship it. Like it's just because we get so insensitive about pricing because it's at the intersection of uncomfortable and important. And whenever you have something at that intersection, you get scared, right? So I think it's more of you should just be constantly doing something. Because something is better than nothing in this case, and the order of what you do it is more of the important part, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I like that you mentioned pricing per user. From other interviews that I've watched of you, you definitely don't like this strategy, and I completely agree with you. And I usually don't advise our clients unless it's absolutely necessary and it's some sort of a value metric. You shouldn't price per user. Explain why you don't like this strategy, and maybe
Yeah.
what are the exceptions and good examples of companies that should price per user.
Yeah, it's a good. So it's I'm against pricing per user. It's more I'm against just copying and pasting what other people have done with price per user. And the reason for it is if you think about it, and I don't know like the ages of everyone listening or watching, but if you were building products, in the 90s or the early 2000s, you lived in an environment where you sold perpetual licenses, right? You sold like software that wasn't on a subscription basis, and when we got to the cloud and selling things on a subscription basis, all of a sudden we entered this world where like, well, how should we charge? Well, what's the closest thing to licenses? Well, I guess we could charge on a per user basis, right? And then everyone just kept doing per user pricing for a long time. And so the issue isn't that that's bad. It's just for a lot of businesses, it's not the ideal way to charge. And the way that you can tell is if you just do a simple thought exercise and just think about like if you and I shared the same login and we were able to like, let's say we have different work we need to do. Like you need to look at marketing stuff. I need to look at sales stuff, but we shared the same login inside the product and we were able to get everything we wanted or everything we needed to do done. You probably shouldn't be using per user pricing. And a lot of people respond by, oh, well, just make it hard for them to share logins. And it's like, whenever you're doing that, you're using the wrong metric. Like you just start using the wrong one. And so the better thing to do is think about like, what is the actual value that you're providing for your products, and think about like, what is the perfect value? And it could be in your B2B, it's typically we save money, we gain money, all these types of things. Indeed, in consumer products, it might be like joy or fun, right? You can't really measure those things, but you can at least like, that's your perfect value. Well, then if you can charge on it and your customer agrees with the charge, great. So our retained product for churn recovery, we can measure how much churn we recover. We can get our customer to agree to it, and we can basically, set a price. But for most of us, we won't have that luxury, and so you want to take a step back and think, what are the proxies for that perfect metric? So if I'm HubSpot, the perfect metric is amount of money gained through using HubSpot software. But they can't really charge based on that because it's hard to get the customer to agree to what they would think the measurement is. So they take a step back and they look at, well, what are all the proxies per contact, per page view, per page, features, these types of things. And then they can kind of figure out like what makes the most sense. But for most of us, per user is actually the wrong type of metric. Now, to kind of flip the original idea to close this out, if I log into your login screen and I can't get my work done because it's so customized to you, it's like your leads, it's your information, and I can't access my information, then you could use per user. But if I don't have, that's kind of the test. But if I don't have that, then I probably shouldn't be using per user.
That makes total sense. Let's talk a little bit more about freemium versus a free version, and why do you advise all products to lead with a freemium version?
Yeah, I think so. I think the future is freemium because the best content you have is your product. It's the best content you have. And it's getting harder and harder to acquire customers, and cost of acquisition is just going up and up and up. And so the result of that is you're looking into an environment where it makes the most sense to basically have something that um, can nurture those users, not on an artificial time horizon. So what I mean by that is, if you think about a sales process, so no freemium or even a free trial, basically you're kind of pushing that user to sign up without really much experience with your product, and you're pushing them on your timeline. And what we're finding just in the markets is that things are moving closer and closer to the timeline of the user. Like, when does the user, like, when does it make sense for them to convert? And because of that, the result is that you want to make sure that you're nurturing that user and you're seeing the value in that user, or that user is seeing the value in your product. And then when it's ready for them to convert, that they convert. And so just to give you some numbers, customer acquisition cost for customers who convert from freemium versus those who convert from traditional channels is typically about 30 to 40% less. Your retention of those customers who convert to paying customers from freemium versus those who converted from kind of like a sales process is typically about 20% more on an absolute basis. And NPS for those users is typically triple those that are converting from just being a regular kind of sales process. And so I think that's where, if you look at what's happening in the market, as our markets become denser and denser because we haven't had a new marketing channel since 2015, you're just seeing math play out in the market. And so I think that the one thing, though, to keep in mind, and I used to be very against freemium for what it's worth. So hopefully that provides a little more credibility, that I'm not just like, a zealot without, considering the other side. But the big thing to kind of keep in mind is it's very much a scalpel. It's not a sledgehammer. And this is where I think a lot of people get this wrong, where they start with freemium. And I actually think most businesses shouldn't start with freemium at all. I think that they should implement freemium basically 1 to 2, maybe 3 years into their business, when they have like learned who their customer is, how to convert that customer from free to paid, and so on and so forth. So I think that's the right way to think about it, essentially.
Right, product-led growth is the way, isn't it?
Yeah.
I watched a video where you say brand and design drive higher willingness to pay. Can you
Yeah.
elaborate on that? And what was the process behind the research? And how did you reach the conclusion that design has such a huge impact on our buyers' decisions? I think that your study found out that if you have an affinity for the design of a brand, your willingness to pay could increase with up to 25%. That's huge, isn't it? So what was the
Yeah,
process there?
totally. So, and the thing to keep in mind is that this is not designed from the perspective of, oh, we would all agree this is a really great design and let's put this in a gallery. It's not from that, because design is from the customer's perception, is a bit, I don't think subjective is the right word, but design has to do with, like, does the person think it's good design? So what we did is we basically measured in that study, we took a bunch of people and we asked them some questions to score their affinity for a particular product's design. And if you're someone who's a truck driver and your app is just designed properly, but it's not pretty, but it's just really easy for you to use, you might have high affinity for the design of that product versus low affinity if it like is so clunky and hard to use. So it's a little bit more of a measure of UX. But there is an element of like UI perception that goes into it. But we basically measured that affinity, and then we measured willingness to pay. And basically what we found is that people who had a low affinity for design, basically their willingness to pay was about 15 to 20% less. And then people who had a high affinity for the design, their willingness to pay was about 15 to 20% more. So there's like a 40-point swing, at the extremes, which is pretty dramatic if you think about it. And the point of that study was to show that basically what's happened is that you're living in an environment where, 5-6 years ago, the data didn't look like this. The data was basically flat. And now you're looking in an environment where, because there aren't as many differentiators, because there's so much stuff out there, things like your brand, things like your design are starting to become more and more important versus, what it looked like previously. So yeah, it's just some extra information to hopefully help folks take this stuff a little more seriously within their businesses.
Right, yeah. And also the industry has matured and the user has become more sophisticated, more demanding. So it totally makes sense for people to be more serious when it comes to product design and usability for sure. So I'm a huge fan of pricing page teardown. I don't know if this is a podcast, whether these are just video series, but I think
Yep.
everyone working on a digital product should watch it. So tell me, what are the golden rules of an outstanding pricing page?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that there's two conversations, right? There's like the visual and the user experience side of this, and then there's the like more pricing element. Because I think that the design of the page in and of itself, like the actual pixels of the page, the hallmarks are people are able to understand where they fit in, meaning like which tier that they should belong to or how much the product is going to be for them. They should be able to understand that within a good 5 to maybe 10 seconds. And so when I go to a pricing page and I have to look at it and I have to study it for a bunch of time to just understand what I'm looking at, like that's really, really problematic. And some products, they kind of get away with this by having really good sales teams. So Salesforce's pricing page is very complicated. It's got an ungodly number of features. It has like a PDF you can download that has like a map legend for you to like understand the pricing page. And they can get away with that because no one really buys Salesforce touchlessly, or maybe people do, but they probably end up talking to someone at some point. So yeah, long story short, it's just one of those things that that is you want to funnel that user to the right place. And then things like social proof, things like, oh, this makes sense, those types of things are really, really important. Now, more important than that is things like the value metric that we talked about, but also making sure that you are basically getting those users in, and then you have a way for them to grow. Because I think a lot of people think about pricing as this single move game where it's like, all right, they're not a customer, they converted, and that's the end, right? Well, in actuality, the beauty of the subscription model is the relationship with the customer is baked into how you make money. So the result of that is that you want your relationship to grow over time, based on the value you're providing and based on that user's happiness or their satisfaction. And so the result is that you essentially want that person paying more and more over time. So the best pricing pages, they get that user in, but then they don't stop beyond the actual page. So those are some things that are hopefully helpful.
Do you have like an example on the top of your mind that you think is like doing an amazing job?
Um, so I think that there's two, and you and I mentioned this before we started recording. I think there's two for very different reasons. So one is Basecamp. And the reason I like to talk about that, I'm just bringing it up on the screen here. So sorry, I'm not looking right at the camera because I want to look here. But what Basecamp does is their whole idea is simplicity, right? So this is not a pricing page that is going to maximize revenue by any means. They have one tier. It's $100 per month, $99 per month. And basically they include everything in that tier. So it's very simple. Like I don't have to make any decisions. It's just, do I want Basecamp or not? And they defend that value with, here's all the teams that signed up last week. Here's all the features. And then they have basically a bunch of other, kind of social proof things to kind of compare them to a competitor, answer questions, talk about how many people are on Basecamp, these types of things. And then another kind of example that's a little bit more like maximizing revenue is a company of HubSpot, where if you go to HubSpot's pricing page, there's a bunch of little things here that they do really, really well. Like for one, they kind of have starter, professional, and enterprise, right? Well, if I'm looking at this, they could do a little bit better by maybe like adding a little blurb of like best for businesses just starting out with HubSpot, but the names kind of imply that, which is great. And then all of a sudden you're looking at a situation where I can kind of funnel myself into the right plan. And then they have a bunch of different little features like, oh, if you pay up front, you're going to end up, saving money. And hey, there's these bundles that you can buy. And they do really well with like having a fairly complicated pricing page, but doing it in a manner that, isn't completely overwhelming. Now, some people would come here and be overwhelmed, don't get me wrong, but they do a really good job by like, easing people into the product, if that makes sense.
Let's say I have a SaaS product for reviews collection. I have three pricing plans, mainly based on the number of collected reviews. But I also have a number of other cool features that I want my customers to try that not everybody uses or needs. How do I decide what I bundle in the main pricing plan and what I leave as an add-on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that the shortest answer to that question is um, the start is of that tier or of that group of people you're selling to, will 40% or more of them use the feature? That's it's a heuristic, right? So it's not exactly going to be 40%, depends on your business a little bit, but that's a really good first test. And if you determine, 40% or more of people are going to use this feature or get retention value out of it, you should include the feature in that bundle. Now, if all of a sudden you think, I think only 40% or less of people are going to use this, the next thing I would do is do a little bit of research in determining what's the willingness to pay that people have for that feature separately, meaning in addition to your core product, in paying for that in addition. And that basically, gets you into a position where you can actually have some really, really good insight around having those add-ons, because add-ons are kind of one of the most underutilized aspects of SaaS pricing besides the value metric. And the reason it's so underutilized is because our instinct is like just dump features into the plans, which is not a terrible instinct. It just all of a sudden you get features and functionality that people just aren't using. And if they're not using it, you're wasting it in that tier when you could sell it to the entire user base rather than just selling it people into that core product. So that's kind of a heuristic. You basically want to find features that not everyone cares about, but the people who care about it are willing to pay more. That's kind of the mental model for add-ons and if you should bundle or unbundle those features.
Right. And I have a couple of more questions before I let you go, Patrick.
Let's do it.
Can you tell me the best tactics you've seen for switching to an annual to an annual plan, sorry, other than obviously lower price and a better deal?
Yeah, there's a lot we could talk about. So let me try to summarize it in a good way. I think that the thing you got to think about. So first, why an annual plan or a 6-month plan or a quarterly plan? They retain at a much higher rate, meaning people who are on an annual plan, their retention is much better than people on a monthly plan. And so you typically want to get those folks on those annual plans quickly. But the problem is we as practitioners, we end up only asking them when they sign up. So they sign up, they've never used your product, presumably, and you're asking them to make a 12-month commitment. It's a little bit much, right? Now you should still ask at the sign up because there's plenty of people who are like actually get the annual plan, depending on your price point. But then what I want to do is like 2 months in to the relationship, on that second month up to probably about 10 months, I want to periodically go out to them and offer them, kind of a reward basically for, hey, you've been so great. Everything's awesome, blah, 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 blah. Let's get you on, this annual plan and we'll give you a discount for basically getting on an annual plan and being such a great customer. Now, the way that you use that discount is really important. Things like percentages off, like 10% off, 15% off, those are actually like less effective than if you said something like 2 months off or 1 month off or $100 off. And so you want to use kind of like physical amounts versus percentages. And then ultimately what that allows you to do is kind of, push things forward in a way that properly gets that person on the annual plan. And there's kind of, if you're a low price product, $10 a month, $20 a month, you actually should have a really good proportion, 40 to 50% of your customers on annual plans. And then if you're a little higher price, it kind of dips down, but you should have at least like 20%. And then it goes kind of back up because ultimately when you start selling like larger products, you end up forcing people into an annual plan. So hopefully that's helpful in just trying to think about like how to get folks on those annuals.
And before I let you go, Patrick, tell me what are the most common mistakes that companies are usually making when it comes to their monetization strategy? What are your clients struggling with before they contact you?
Yeah, I think honestly, it's not like there's some interesting things that are pricing related, but more often than not, they are not like taking it seriously at all. Like it's not that they don't know it's important; it's just that they haven't done anything. So I think it's just, I recommend to people like, hey, just put a calendar invite for once every 2 to 3 months. Maybe you snooze it every so often, but just like, hey, we should implement some sort of change or some sort of experiment with our pricing. And people think it's just the number. Like that's such a small part, interestingly enough, of pricing and packaging. It has to do with all these other things that influence your revenue per customer. And so normally what I say is like, don't worry about, don't worry about like doing things complicated, just get momentum. So like taking it seriously. And then the other thing is like deadlines and decision makers, which is kind of like the other part of this. It's not really a sexy concept, but it's like, you're going to paralyze yourself with analysis, mainly because you haven't done this before and it's uncomfortable. But you have to treat it like everything else in your business that you haven't done, but was still uncomfortable, and you thought through it and you figured something out. So I think that's like the big thing, is just making sure that you're pushing things forward, and then ultimately you're getting into a position where you're actually making changes. Some of the other big mistakes, I kind of mentioned this already. Only thinking that the price point is the most important thing, and not worrying about everything else. I think some people, they have too many politics within their organization. It's really hard to make any changes because everyone's scared and no one wants to talk about it. And then I think there's some like a little more practical things. I think value metrics, you should be pricing based on a value metric. You should be pricing with add-ons, these types of things, because those are like two really, really big growth levers. The rest of it is important, but there's a little bit more of a struggle that comes with those just internally.
Right. So we go back to the point, don't be lazy. Be proactive when it comes to your pricing.
That's exactly right.
Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your wisdom with us. Where can people find you on the internet?
I'm just Patrick Campbell. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn. That's where I do most of my postings and stuff. Or you can just send me an email at patrick@profitwell.com. Sometimes it takes a little while for me to get back to everybody, but I tend to get back to everybody, with questions and things. And you can go to our blog, profitwell.com/recur. We have a ton of content on pricing, retention, benchmarks, these types of things. So I'm more than happy to help.
The Product Show is brought to you by Pony, a design studio helping startups and scale-ups build and optimize their digital products at speed. Check pony.studio to learn more.